The latest edition of the National Agricultural Worker Survey indicates that roughly 51% of migrant farm workers are unauthorized. Many of them experience discrimination, many of them experience racism, many of them experience their labor rights not being respected, both in everyday life at the grocery store, interacting with other people in line, or at work. The majority of them are from Latin America, with 84% being from Mexico. Many of those people in California speak different languages. Many speak Spanish, but there are also many who speak indigenous languages, including some of the indigenous languages from the Mexican state of Oaxaca, including Zapotec, Mixtec, Triqui, Chatino, but also indigenous languages from Guatemala, and from other Mexican states like Chiapas. And many of those people experience difficulty in seeking healthcare or interacting with the government because we tend not to have interpreters, first in Spanish, but much less in the indigenous languages. So there's a great diversity of the people who pick our vegetables, harvest our vegetables, care for the vegetable plants in the state of California. Many times they experience being treated as though they are marginal or are not important, even though what they're contributing is part of what allows our society, our whole society, which is diverse and interesting in California, to function.
There's a huge variety of jobs and tasks that are required at today's vegetable farms. In general, we can think of this work as being broken down into a variety of categories. So we might think about management, planning, quality assurance, marketing, day-to-day production activities. There's supervising that needs to happen. There's HR activities. There's legal compliance. There's very physically intensive manual labor tasks that need to happen, harvest activities, irrigation. And there's also a huge diversity in terms of the types of operations that are doing this work. So there's large farms, there's small farms, there's farms that produce one particular commodity, there's farms that produce a huge bundle of commodities that you can buy. Regardless of the scale or the size of the farm or what particular crops they're growing, all vegetable production farms are typically going to employ a variety of production managers, and they're going to have expertise ranging from agronomy to soil science to pest management to irrigation to equipment handling to maybe some expertise in management, and probably they'll have some history in harvesting.
Who are the people involved in producing our vegetables? Well, there's typically two kinds of people involved. Farm operators and their unpaid family members get the revenue from the sale of the crop, and their income is the difference between the revenue that they get, the money they get for selling the crop, and the cost they incur to produce the crop. So the farmer's income can go up or down with things like yield and market prices. Hired farm labor, on the other hand, gets a certain wage regardless of what the markets or the yields are. So if you hire a worker at the California minimum wage of $16 an hour, he or she gets $16 an hour, whether the yield is good or the yield is poor, whether the price is high or the price is low. So we have to distinguish between farmers and their families and hired workers. Hired workers, in turn, come in many different skill levels and wage levels. So the California minimum wage is $16 an hour in 2024, and most equipment operators earn more than the minimum wage. If you have a $500,000 tractor, chances are you don't want to entrust that to a minimum wage worker. So equipment operators typically earn $18 or $19 an hour. They typically earn somewhere between 15 and 20% more than the minimum wage. They also tend to be employed more hours per year, more weeks and more hours per year. And the same is true of irrigators. Long hours, although with irrigators, they're typically paid the minimum wage. Now we come to the harvest. And with harvesting, there are several different wage systems. All workers in California are guaranteed the minimum wage, which is $16 for the state. If you are an H-2A guest worker, that's $19.75 an hour. But when I'm a farmer and I've got big fields, I typically want to know what it's going to cost me to get a crop harvested, even if some workers are fast and some workers are slow. And in order to decide that, he or she has to decide, am I going to grow something on a contract basis, or am I going to grow it and then sell it on a spot market basis? Also, once I decide what crop to grow, it's a matter of getting the seeds or the plants if it's transplanted, and getting the equipment to prepare the soil, the irrigation infrastructure to make sure the plants get water, taking care of thinning and weeding and other things, and that is the pre-harvest phase. Then comes the harvest phase, which is typically the most labor intensive, and this is really where the money then starts coming back to the farm, because without the harvesting of a commodity that can be sold, it won't be profitable. The post-harvest phase is typically relatively short, depends on the crop, because the crop can be packed in the field, therefore it's ready to leave the field in the same way you would buy it at the supermarket, so a bagged head of lettuce, or it may be a commodity that first goes to a packing shed for further work. So if it's a bagged salad, the heads of lettuce will go to a plant where they're washed and cored and then mixed and put into salad bags. So the kinds of people involved include those who either own the land or rent the land, decide which crops to grow, so the management challenges. Then it's the equipment operation in terms of preparing the soil and getting the crop planted, and there can be labor involved in that, but typically that's not very labor intensive. Then there is thinning and weeding and irrigating the crop, and finally there's harvesting it and taking it from the field. So those are the main phases in producing a vegetable crop.
My name is Justin Diener, and we're at Red Rock Ranch in Five Points, California. I work here every day, and I'm responsible for business management. I call myself the office manager, but I help coordinate the activities on our farm, both on an annual basis and on a weekly and daily basis. Annually, we come up with a crop plan that will, we hope will meet our financial objectives and our long-term objectives as a business and a family on the farm. And then we break that down into monthly and weekly activities to execute that annual plan. And to execute that plan, we employ employees that are specialists in equipment, irrigation, and we have outside professionals who assist us with pest management, fertility, and agronomy. For my role at our farm, I have basically two roles that I kind of look at. One is I really enjoy the farming side of things, so I pay attention to the crops, the progress the crops are making, the challenges I see in the fields, and that relies on skills I've acquired from my father, from reading, from other people, from my brother who's a PCA and others about agronomy. And secondly, I rely a lot on my business skills, which I acquired through my education in economics and accounting and banking to help manage the business aspect of the farm. The idea that I could come back, contribute something positively to our family's farming operation and make it sustainable from a financial perspective, and then the other aspects of, longer term managing things correctly, is just what I really enjoy, and that's why I came back to be part of our family farming operation.
I'm Kevin Collins. I'm ranch manager at Borba Farms. We're in the Huron area in western Fresno County. We currently grow about 6,000 acres of processed tomatoes, processed and fresh garlic, fresh market melons, being cantaloupes and honeydews, and lettuce. It's all about profitability. And in our vegetable production, it's about maintaining long-term contractual agreements with processors and packers. The way to develop and maintain long-term relationships with a processor or a shipper of fresh vegetables is by being consistently producing a good quality crop, being able to manage that crop on their behalf. Sometimes it's their money, sometimes it's ours. Being able to procure water and labor to make those things happen. So there's a lot of logistics behind producing and delivering that crop. The grower's part in vegetable production for fresh market has changed over the years. We now contract mainly with shippers of lettuce and melons such that it's their investment in the crop. We're custom farming for them. We're not in the market anymore. And what's driven grower individuals out of the marketplace is the volatility of that. So the shipper is taking the true market risk. Our risk is providing our land and water and people and trying to stay profitable and being paid by the carton or by the acre. But our main interest is having that long-term relationship so that when we go get our financing, we can tell them, yes, we're still dealing with this packer, this processor. In the processed vegetable business, tomatoes and garlic, it is our money, it's our investment. We're paid solely on the yield, but we do not have a market risk, we have a contracted price on those crops. So we've gone from being the risk taker in the marketplace to just the risk taker dealing with Mother Nature and the yields alone. Me being the farm manager, I have foremen and assistants and laborers, both in irrigation and tractor drivers, that it's all about having the overall plan. In all of these crops, we have a planting schedule that's given us by the buyer, by that packer or shipper. They are involved in the varieties we grow and when to plant and harvest. So we're given that, and then from that point we take it over and we have to produce a crop. And on delivery, it is also harvested by the same shippers, whether it's labor or mechanical harvested. We coordinate with them to come in and have that crop ready on the day or within a week of when it's scheduled to be harvested. To accomplish any of these crops, we work with chemical suppliers and sales. We work with custom applicators. We have companies that transplant tomatoes for us. We deal with labor contractors for probably 2/3 of our seasonal labor force to grow the crop. At harvest time, it's completely labor contractor driven. Our biggest challenge right now is labor, getting a reliable labor source, getting a legal labor source, and we have to work closely with outside contractors to procure that. Even 10, but for sure 20 years ago, you had people drive up alongside the field that would stop you or your foreman and ask for work. And it was not a problem getting someone else to put on a crew. Today, even with higher wages, people don't want to do this work. And it's more and more evident that our most reliable source of labor still does come from outside the country. whether that's Mexico, Central America, which a lot of our labor comes from. So what's important to us, immigration reform is a very important issue for the farmers in this area. And without a reliable legal source coming in, which we're working on, we won't continue to do what we're doing. I think as a young person that's interested in agriculture, things have changed out here on the farm. We no longer seem to be able to get young people who will work the same as I work as far as the time put in. And I'm over that as far as judging that. I understand that. I have 2 young daughters that are out in that millennial age, and neither one of them intends to work as much as I do to make a living, and they shouldn't have to. Don't be afraid of that, because things are changing in the farming, the uses of technology, and just the realization that someone's not going to work 7 days a week to get this done. It can be done in less time than that. You just can't always teach an old dog new tricks. But it can be done, and you should not be afraid of the work part. There's huge opportunities in agriculture right now for people that are technologically savvy. In the water management, food safety areas of it is going to continue to grow. The need for college-educated people coming into our industry.
My name is Wes Carter. I'm the farm manager for Bulls Farming. We're here at our Bulls Farming operation in Los Panas, California. My job as a farm manager is to help coordinate the day-to-day activities on the farm in vegetable farming. We grow a variety of different crops, from different types of melons, watermelons, corn, from anywhere from corn nuts to sweet corn, and some varieties of field corn. We also grow a lot of processing tomatoes. So if you like your ketchup and your pasta sauce, we're the guys that grow it for you. My job typically starts around 4:30 in the morning. I'll come and open up the shop, and then around probably 5:30, the guys start showing up, and then I'll coordinate operations with them, from anywhere from tractor operations. I'll set the guys up with directions to go, what crops need to be cultivated, or ground that needs to be tilled. I also get with the sprinkler crews, which I'll show them which fields I want to do, how many hours you need per crop, and what needs to be done there, as well as the drip irrigation department. I'll tell them which crops I want to put water on, how many hours need to be per crop, and then I'll go into the furrow irrigation department, which and do the same thing, kind of give him direction of where he's going, what he's going to do for the day. And then there's also the operations facility, which is the shop. So I will help coordinate with that foreman right there to tell him, what equipment needs to be serviced, what equipment needs to be worked on, and where the locations of these equipment are located. I started as a young boy working with my grandfather, and he was a farmer, and he was also a PCA for probably 30-something odd years before he retired. And he kind of schooled me in on the information of what needs to do in the process of farming, from day-to-day operations, food safety, chemical applications, and just all around anything that has to be performed on a farm. Yes, there is still opportunities for people to get employment, for young people, I should say, to get employment in agriculture. We highly recommend it because agriculture doesn't have a big margin of young people that are interested in doing this kind of work. It is kind of a dying breed. So the people that want to do it, we highly encourage it. I enjoy my line of work. It's not just because I grew up in it, but it's something that I really enjoy doing. Starting with a seed and growing it to a crop that that's going to be out there in the general public, and it's something that people are going to enjoy, not just me and my family or the people on the farm. Mostly what I enjoy about farming is it's something that gives me happiness, to come out every day to day-to-day aspect. It's not an easy job, I can tell you that, and it does take a person that's really interested in doing something like this.
My name is Chuck Herrin. I'm a farm labor contractor here in the Central Valley. As time has rolled on over the last few decades, ag has become extremely restricted. Farmers have started to rely on contractors to supply their labor sources and take care of the governmental restrictions, and that's what we do. We supply ranches with workers for various tasks. We educate them on safety issues, practices, rules, and regulations to hopefully keep everybody safe. several companies that I work for grow cannery tomatoes, and one organization here that I'm affiliated with, Worth Farms, they have their own harvesting company, and we supply the labor for that. We'll put out flyers throughout various communities in the surrounding area that we're going to be taking applications for machine drivers, tractor drivers, sorters, ticket writers, both day and night. And social media has become a very big part of recruiting people also. Facebook and other lines of being able to reach out and get people.
My name is Cindia Martinez. I'm the safety director here at Sunrise Farm Labor. My job here is to make sure that everybody is working safe. Our jobs vary. We do weeding, we do tomato harvest, we do almond harvest, we do pistachio harvest, onion harvest, we do pruning. The benefits of working with the farm labor contractor with us is that we provide free medical coverage to farm workers. We also do sick pay, 40 hours of sick pay per year. Here at Sunrise, we do once a month provide a mobile clinic that comes out here for free. I believe that health is very important for our farm workers.
We are a small family-owned farm, so when you're small, you have to do a little bit of everything pretty much around the farm. I manage like financial stuff for the farm, also keeping up with all the new regulations coming out for the farm. I'm also the delivery driver and harvester. We do a little bit of everything, so it's always trying to manage and see how can we help out the employees, which we're all also out there, so we know how it is. Even till now, all of us are still out in the fields, and we try to finish the hard labor out there in the field before it gets too hot, and then we all come under here and start packing so we can stay out of the heat. As an employee, it's a good job. I mean, it's hard, labor intensive. When he was an employee, he would just worry about getting, doing his job at work, and then once you clock out, that's it. You don't worry about anything else. But once you transition to being the owner, he has a lot of more problems that come with that. It's not all just I'm gonna make this plan and this, but he's almost like, he feels like you're working double now because he's out here working on the tractor, doing making decisions on what to plant, and then he still has to go and harvest and irrigate.
Pero también tuvimos muy bonitas experiencias porque aprendimos mucho de esos trabajos a realizar el trabajo de nosotros.
Even with all those struggles and hard times, it was rewarding in the way that they learned how to overcome everything, and now they're here, with their own business, and all that hard labor and experience they had made them stronger.
Some crops are picked by piece rate wages. So a piece rate wage system, an incentive wage system, is a wage system that guarantees you a minimum wage, but allows you to earn more than the minimum wage if you do sufficient work. So if I'm picking tomatoes for $1 a bucket, and the minimum wage is $16 an hour. Then if I pick 16 buckets an hour, I earn the minimum wage. But if I pick 20 buckets an hour, I earn $20 an hour. So the incentive for me is to pick faster.
The major farm labor problem has always been seasonality, which means that farmers need more workers during some times of the year than they do in other times, typically during the harvest time. What that means is that people have to be on standby waiting for work to begin so that farmers can hire them when they're needed. Those standby farm workers are mostly newcomers to California who are willing to stand by for seasonal farm work because they have few other U.S. job options.
So where does farm work fit in to the U.S. labor market? The average hourly wage of private sector workers in the United States is $35 an hour. And if you work 50 weeks a year, 40 hours a week, you work 2,000 hours. And if you multiply $35 an hour times 2,000 hours, you earn $70,000. And that's the average earnings of a full-time private sector worker. Farm workers tend to earn about half as much per hour as non-farm workers, and they work about half as many hours. So if I am earning half of $35, I'm earning $17.50, and if I'm working 1,000 hours instead of 2,000 hours, I'm going to have 1/4 as much income. I'll have $17,500 instead of $70,000. So the problem for harvest workers for the past 150 years of California agriculture is not so much the hourly wage, since the hourly wage is typically above the minimum wage, especially with those incentive wages, but it's the fact that we have a biological production process and a seasonal demand for labor. And therefore, most harvest workers typically have earnings, annual earnings, on the order of $15,000 to $25,000. And therefore, if they have U.S. educated children, those U.S. educated children tend to want non-farm jobs that offer year-round work, sometimes higher wages, sometimes similar wages, but non-farm work, more benefits, and more opportunities for upward mobility. Seasonal farm workers in California have almost always been newcomers to the state without any other job options, or with few other job options. The first seasonal farm workers were Chinese who had been imported to help build the railroad through the Sierra Mountains. When the railroad was finished in 1869, they were laid off. Many moved into San Francisco. And so to summarize a long story, the Chinese were driven out of San Francisco and Sacramento, and they became the first seasonal farm workers. Why? Because they did not have other U.S. job options. The U.S. stopped Chinese immigration. We brought in Japanese workers. After the Japanese, it was the Filipinos. We brought in people from what was then British India, Hindus, Punjabis, finally Mexicans in the 1920s, the Dust Bowl Okies and Arkies in the 1930s. But in every case, the seasonal workers were typically people new to the state with few other job options. And so agriculture has what you might think of as a revolving door labor market. It's a job, it's not a career for most people. The current workforce is primarily men born in rural Mexico, most of whom arrived illegally in the 1990s and early 2000s when they were in their 20s. They're now in their 40s. They're settled in one place. They're not migrating around the state. They have U.S. educated children who are not following them into the fields. And that's why California agriculture, the vegetable industry, is at a transition point. What's it going to do? Will we mechanize more than we already have? Will we bring in H-2A guest workers?
I am Steve Fennimore. I am an extension specialist, extension professor with the University of California. I've been in Salinas for almost 27 years, and my primary duties are working on weed control and vegetable crops that they grow here, things like broccoli and lettuce and spinach and strawberries. It's very labor intensive. I grew up on a farm in Oregon, and we did raise vegetables, but I'd never seen the amount of labor any place like the Salinas Valley. You can get into a field and get into a traffic jam because there's so many people harvesting or weeding. And what has happened here in the last 10 to 15 years is really a a revolution in technology, and it coincided with increasing labor costs and decreasing labor availability. And the things that have happened are like lettuce thinning, which lettuce is planted at very high densities to ensure a stand. In Salinas, for example, the lettuce planting for the spring crop, the first harvest happens in early January, right after Christmas, right after the holidays. And the soils are quite cool, the weather is quite wet, and so to ensure a stand, they plant at high densities. And the traditional way of thinning was by hand with hose, and so that is very labor intensive, and it's become quite expensive. That's been mechanized with the automated thinners, which are spraying a material to kill the lettuce at the particular locations, and so that they get 8 or 9 or 10 inch spacings between the plants within the rows, so that they get, by the time of harvest, they end up with a nice romaine heart or head lettuce or green leaf lettuce, whatever the particular crop may be. They have been using these automated thinners now for well over 10 years. We knew that was a hit, and I'm an extension, and so we have field days. And you can sort of gauge the interest based on how many people show up. Well, Marc Siemens, my colleague from the University of Arizona at Yuma, built a prototype lettuce thinner, and we had a field day in 2011, and we had like 120 growers show up. So we knew, holy smoke, this is incredible. And he had a very crude prototype, and one grower tried to buy it at the field day. And so we obviously knew this is something. And so then a lot of technology companies who were present at that field day saw the same thing, and Blue River was one of them. And they built they built an incredible lettuce thinner, and then John Deere bought them, and they left the area. But there's a number of other companies that have filled in the gaps. Thinning was followed shortly by the weeding. We brought a RoboVator from Denmark in 2014, and we were demonstrating that to a number of growers, both in Salinas and in Santa Maria. And again, the growers kept asking to see the machine because they wanted to show it to this or that manager from the company. And that's how, of course, you can tell that they're really interested when they, of course, keep asking you to come back. And what happened after that was commercial development of automated weeders. These machines actually recognize the difference between a weed and a lettuce plant, a broccoli plant, a spinach plant, or many, many other things, tomatoes and as such. So that has allowed some very sophisticated machines to be developed. Technology in the Salinas Valley, for example, I've heard quite a few people say there's no place quite like it in the world. And the reason is because of the very high value of the crops that are grown here. But they're very small markets, and they're very much niche. And because, let's face it, we're producing human food, and people want choices. And so the difference between this and corn in the Midwest is that it's so much more complex. You have different plantings, you have different pack size, you have different markets, some very sophisticated companies that are in touch with their consumers. And so there really isn't a single technology that fits all of this, and so it's much more complex. these growers don't have the big ag behind them like big agriculture in the central part of the U.S. and in the Mid-South have. They have to do it themselves, and they work hard. So where is the industry going here? Well, they are producing healthy food that consumers want. I believe it will be more sophisticated in terms of monitoring of moisture. Application to irrigation will continue to become more and more sophisticated and more prescribed to the crop needs. The nutrients, the same, we will have more and more sensors. We will be able to detect pathogens and insect pests more readily. Weeds will continue to be controlled by a number of different mechanisms, mechanical and chemical. I believe for students that they need to be conscious of all of this change, and they need to have the skills to deal with this technology. Do they need to know how to code? I don't know, but they probably should know how machine vision works. They should understand what convolutional neural networks are. They should not be afraid to start their own companies and create their own technology. That, I believe, is the exciting part, is that this is a much broader stage. You don't need to be a John Deere or a Syngenta. You can be a startup company and create something that has value, that reduces production costs, that reduces inputs. That is a tremendous opportunity for young people.
The H-2A program is a government program that was developed originally in 1952 and modified in 1986. And what it does is it says that a U.S. farm employer who anticipates labor shortages can get permission, certification is the exact word, to employ legal H-2A guest workers if that employer tries and fails to recruit U.S. workers, and the presence of these H-2A workers will not adversely affect similar U.S. workers. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, the try and fail means you have to put together a job ad, go post it at your local state workforce agency, and then interview anybody who responds. Almost no one responds to employer ads. The more controversial part is the no adverse effect. In order to prevent adverse effect, the government sets a super minimum wage. That's the so-called adverse effect wage rate. That's the 1975 rate here in California that is quite a bit higher than the $16 minimum wage. So if I, as an employer, satisfy that look and fail for U.S. workers and pay the adverse effect wage rate, I can recruit guest workers. And we are recruiting ever more guest workers to work in vegetables. Traditionally, this was a program for the East Coast. And traditionally, the main source of the workers was Jamaica. But that all changed in the 1990s. The source switched to Mexico, and California, which accounts for about 1/3 of U.S. hired labor, is now the second leading employer after Florida of H-2A workers. So more and more California farmers are saying, I'm willing to spend the extra money in order to ensure that I have workers available when they're needed. And the way to do that is to bring in H-2A workers. Those H-2A workers have to be housed by the employer at no cost to the worker, and they have to be transported from that housing to and from the field. So the actual cost of an H-2A worker is higher than a similar U.S. worker. On the other hand, the H-2A workers are more productive. They're typically younger. better educated, and they usually will pick between 15 and 30% more boxes or buckets or bins per hour or per day. So it's a higher cost, but it's also a higher productivity. And with that labor insurance, more and more California farmers are deciding to employ H-2A workers. I think one has to be honest. The history of farm labor is not a good history. I mean, when the history of seasonal farm labor in particular has often been a story that we would rather not remember. After all, when we think back, the United States developed 3 major responses to the need for seasonal labor in agriculture. In the Northeast and the Midwest, we developed family farms and big families. And we adjusted school schedules so that children were available to help on the family farm when they were needed for the harvest season. And those family farms got fewer and larger as mechanization took over in corn and hay and everything else. In the southern states, where we had longer season cotton and tobacco, we had a slave system because the economics were such that a plantation owner could justify housing and food year-round to ensure that seasonal workers were available. In the western states, we developed a reliance on newcomers from abroad to be available when they were needed to fill seasonal jobs, but then look out for themselves when there was no farm work available. What has changed in California and Washington and other western states that followed that newcomer seasonal model is that we have adopted laws that actually give farm workers, hired workers, more rights than many non-farm workers. The Agricultural Labor Relations Act in California is actually the most pro-union labor law in the United States. And California recently enacted overtime for farm workers on the same basis as non-farm workers. So farm work is different. It is a seasonal industry, but nonetheless, the state legislature said we're going to treat farm work the same as any other work. One of the things that I've taught my students is that when you look at farm labor laws, it's often important to read the purpose of the law, assume exactly the opposite will occur in practice, and you'll usually be correct. Example, when the Agricultural Labor Relations Act was passed in 1975, the UFW claimed contracts on 200 plus farms and 70,000 members. Today, the UFW has about 5,000 members and about 20 farms under contract. So after 50 years, we have far fewer farm workers in unions than we did 50 years ago. When the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed in 1986, the best guess is that about 25% of California farm workers were not authorized to work in the U.S. Today, it's 50%. So when overtime was enacted, the theory was that farm workers would now have higher earnings. Well, they would have higher earnings if they worked the same number of hours and got the wage premium. So far, that does not appear to be functioning as planned. So if there's one lesson, that we do have a history of seasonal farm labor, which does not necessarily highlight the best of America. But when trying to, as it were, fix it, we have to always be careful of how we go about making the fixes, because the people we're intending to help may not necessarily be helped by what we do.
As a medical doctor and a cultural anthropologist who's interested in the health and healthcare of farm workers, I've also read many of the studies that show that the well-being and health of farm workers is negatively impacted by their living conditions that are often difficult, by the lack of financial resources they have, by their conditions of work, and by the ways in which they're treated in general in society. We know that farm workers in the United States have increased rates of many health problems, including different forms of cancer, different forms of malformations of children being born prematurely. We also know that many farm workers experience increased rates of problems with well-being in general and mental health, including insomnia, anxiety, and these people are experiencing these health problems largely because of the conditions they live in order to feed all of our society. I was recently grateful to be part of a team of farm worker families and researchers from the University of California working together, interviewing migrant farm worker families in California about their experience of life during COVID. And we found in that study that roughly 2/3 or 2 out of 3 families of farm workers did not make enough money in California to be able to afford to have 2 or 3 full meals of food each day. So ironically, we know that the people who work very hard providing food for me and everyone I know themselves have difficulty affording food. We know that our well-being, our realities are very linked. My well-being is very linked to the migrant farm workers who live in California, and their well-being is linked to mine and me. I understand that all of our society, therefore, in many ways needs to be responsible for each other. We need to care about the conditions in which farm workers live and work. We need to respect the labor that they provide, and we need to respect the interesting and important knowledge and cultural diversity and practices and experiences that they add to California, as well as the labor that they provide.
My name is Gerardo Reyes Chavez. I'm a farm worker and an organizer with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. I have been a farm worker since I was a kid, first in Mexico since I was 11 years old. Then I came to work in the agricultural industry, hearing a lot about promises that when you arrive here, you realize that they are all big lies, trying to recruit you, trying to make you believe that you are going to be earning money that would be enough for you to live in a dignified manner for your family. All of that are lies that people hear very often. And when I arrived, my welcoming to Immokalee, which is where we live, is the southwest part of Florida, where the heart of the agricultural industry in this part of the country, it's also located. Immokalee being an unincorporated town that was created as a labor reserve, made up mainly by workers like myself from Mexico, workers from Guatemala, from Haiti, and some workers from Central America too. We are in this community fighting to improve the wages and working conditions. That's what I found, but not before I met a crew leader that took our money, kicked us out of the housing, and in the same week, after working for 2 weeks, we were homeless, jobless, moneyless. We didn't know anyone. And that was my welcoming. And the reason for that was because we asked for $20 to buy utensils and basic staples to cook our own food, because we were getting sick with the food that was imposed on us. We were getting in debt with this person who was a family member, I think, of the crew leader. And when we asked for those $20, he took it as an insult, probably to us criticizing the food that was making us ill. And he got mad, so he fired us. And it was on that desperate search for work, for a place to stay, and trying to figure out, what to do. The context in agriculture has changed with the implementation of H-2A visas, which are guest worker visas for agriculture. But the system itself came without any kind of overseeing to make sure that workers are protected under these visas. And the visa system has been used always as the means to bring people, force them to work by retaining their documents in many instances, threatening their families because they know where they live and they are in charge of their recruitment. And there's no protection for workers in the field. So even though the context has changed over time, the conditions have not when it comes to farm workers, where there's no organization, where there's no system in place. That's why we, when I got involved with the coalition in 1989, the community was planning a march of 234 miles from Fort Myers to Orlando. This was a march that included a Lady of Liberty that was brown skin. Instead of the torch, this Lady Liberty was carrying a tomato. And instead of the tablet, she was carrying a tomato bucket. We carry that statue to the headquarters of the Florida Fruit and Vegetables Association with the hope that they would meet with us. But that wasn't the case. They just closed the door, gave the day to everyone, so they locked doors and everything. And what we learned from that and from other actions, because there were general strikes taking place in Immokalee with more than 3,000 workers every time during the 90s, 95, 97, and 99. There was a hunger strike where 6 workers went without food for 30 days. And they were asking for a place in the table with the growers to have dialogue, to talk about how to eliminate the conditions of wage theft, stagnation of wages that was the same since 1978, which was 40 to 45 cents per a 32-pound bucket of tomatoes. That means that in a normal single day, a worker would have to pick 2.5 tons of tomatoes. That means that you have to run constantly to push yourself in the fields to be able to catch with that quota. That came without many of the protections that exist in many other industries and in a couple of states here in the U.S. due to the exclusion from the National Labor Relations Act that was signed in the 30s that denied workers in the fields and workers that were taking care of the homes, the nannies that do that work, taking care of families and all of that. They were denied those protections because they were African American workers mainly, and that exclusion continues up to today. So when this hunger strike took place, a smaller, relatively small grower asked one of the bigger growers, "Why is it so hard for you to sit at the table with these workers? I mean, you don't have to agree with their demands. We don't have to concede to anything, but don't you think that they have earned at least the opportunity to be heard, to sit at the table and to talk?" The answer of this grower was, "I'm going to put it to you this way. A tractor doesn't tell a farmer how to run his farm." That prompted another action by the community that painted a big tractor. People put their names and the inscription in it was, "I'm not a tractor." But it was that action and the march that we did, where they received us with shut doors, zero dialogue, that forced us to rethink our approach, because we were, as a community, fighting to have a dialogue, to talk about how to eliminate sexual harassment from the fields that was impacting most women, how to eliminate violence. The agricultural industry injects a lot of money in trying to come up with new varieties of tomatoes to be able to be in the good side of the market. And with their incredible growth, they started to ask for more and more tomatoes, forcing a consolidation of the industry that was forced to decrease the margin of profit, but expand the level of production so that they could keep profits coming in and they could keep in business. At the same time, they needed to do something that directly connected with our lives, which was cutting cost of production. Now, growers, it doesn't matter how big they get, they're not going to be able to turn to you or Monsanto and say, hey, I need to pay you the same price as 20, 30 years ago for the machinery or for the fertilizers that I need on my farm. But there was always a place where they turned to keep that cost of production lower, and that was the workforce. That's why there's a direct, the way we see it, there's a direct connection between the extreme wealth at the top of the corporate supply chain and the extreme poverty and stagnation of wages at the bottom of that same supply chain. So we knew we needed to bring the big buyers to be part of the solution because they were directly responsible with that immense pressure of many of the conditions that happen at the bottom. In terms of abuses, they also had the power to ask for a different treatment for workers, a dignified treatment of workers in their own supply chain, but they never moved the finger. So the idea of the campaign for fair food started right in that moment when we started to analyze that. And our theory of change was that if the market, which is not good, inherently good or bad, the market is merely a tool, right? It depends on how it is used, that it can have horrible consequences for people. So if the market is responsible for this pressure that sentenced us to continue to receive stagnant wages for decades, and by its inaction in regards to human rights abuses in the fields and modern day slavery, we are continuing to see all of these abuses happening in our everyday lives, then the market needs to be the tool that reverses its own impact. That's how we crafted our demands. We started with a penny per pound. We included zero tolerance for modern day slavery and the creation of a code of conduct that would include us in the creation as well as in the implementation at the table with growers that supply corporations that we were targeting. We started with Taco Bell. That was 2001, and that was a process that got us to the beginning of the campaign for fair food. We were absolutely alone. A lot of people thought that we totally lost it. They would say things like, you have done a great job fighting against abuses, but don't you think it's too much to expect that one of the poorest communities in the nation is going to be able to sit at the table with the ultimate power, with the largest fast food corporations on the world? And we said, they are the key to be able to change the conditions, to force their suppliers to do the right thing. And that's how we started. We knew that it was not going to be easy. We knew that we were alone. Only a few allies around our community knew about our fight, knew about our conditions. So we needed to raise awareness across the country. We set and take the road with 2 buses, 15 days traveling to Irvine, California and back, stopping in 17 different cities on that trip and doing an action in front of Taco Bell headquarters. That allow us to connect with students, with religious leaders, with other workers. And now we're seeing this with H2A. That's the new form in which workers are recruited, brought to this country, forced to work, threatened to be killed. And that's how a lot of people end up in conditions of modern day slavery. So it's a myth, I would say, because the reality it's different. Every worker who is working in agriculture, whatever there's no oversight, is on the risk of abuses. We can certainly say that, yeah, there's good bosses, there's good farms, yeah, but for the most part, that's not what the workers experience, today. You see a lot of wage theft. You see a lot of situations where workers' documentation is being retained. You see the fear of workers to speak up because they are also threatened to be sent back home and placed on the blacklist. So employers use a lot of tactics of intimidation and to take advantage of workers, to don't pay them correctly. So all of that leads to, again, conditions of modern day slavery, because it's a continuum. So in order to eliminate the possibilities of modern day slavery, we need to work to change the conditions that are considered normal in agriculture. The norm needs to improve. By improving that, we eliminate the conditions that makes fertile ground for these cases to emerge. The latest cases that we have seen involve workers under H-2A visas, all of them. So all of them were here with a permit, and all of them were treated in that form. One other thought that comes to my mind is, at the end, the protection of the human rights of workers should not be dependent on the well-being of growers, because sometimes people say no, or take offense even, like, oh no, but we are more progressive. We are a better grower than most. So no, that's not happening here. Well, that might be the case. That's not the case for the majority of workers in the United States that come to work in the fields. And the dignity of a worker shouldn't depend on the well-being of a few small examples. We need rules to make sure that workers are not taken advantage of.
Mi nombre es María y yo trabajo en empaques y en los files. Pues realmente el trabajo es muy duro del campo. No es fácil el trabajo del campo. Más cuando tenemos que trabajar en condiciones climáticas como cuando el clima está muy caliente. Sí, en mi compañía todavía ahí sí nos respetan los derechos porque trabajamos bajo contrato de unión. Pero en otros lados donde no trabajamos bajo contrato de unión, realmente no respetan nuestros derechos. Sí, en algunos lugares todavía no respetan nuestros derechos. En algunos lugares los baños están sucios, súper sucios. El agua casi no es agua apropiada para tomar. Nos gritan, exigen trabajo. Pues porque ellos quieren su trabajo, ellos quieren sacar su trabajo y no les importa si la gente puede o no. Ellos quieren sacar su trabajo. Sí, porque al decirle que nos están exigiendo el trabajo, por ejemplo, son 8 horas, trabajamos por horas, ¿verdad? 8 horas, 7 horas. En ese tiempo de 7, 8 horas, quieren que hagamos mucha producción, o sea, como si estuviéramos por contrato. Y eso es en todas partes. El trabajo del campo también es muy mal pagado, porque nos pagan lo mínimo y a la hora del día, pues apenas si sacamos para traer a la casa lo necesario. No contamos con protecciones que nos puedan ayudar a nosotros para poder estar bien en el trabajo o para poder proveer más beneficios para mi familia. Y si me pasa un accidente en el trabajo, me mandan con un doctor de ellos y nomás dicen, oh, estás bien, y me ponen a trabajar así lastimada o simplemente me corren del trabajo. Sí, claro, la UFW me ha enseñado cómo defenderme. UFW he aprendido mucho cómo hablarle a mi supervisor cuando me está gritando, decirle que tengo derechos como trabajadora. Sí, la Unión de Campesinos, Farmworkers, cuando yo entré a trabajar a la compañía de Star Rosas, yo no tenía conocimiento de la Unión de Campesinos. Cuando yo empecé a trabajar en Star Rosas y descubrí que estaba la Unión, empecé a mirar las diferencias. Las diferencias son, cuando tú trabajas bajo contrato de unión, tienes días festivos pagados, tienes tus horas de enfermedad, tienes derecho a permanecer en tu trabajo como la señoría, también te respetan tu derecho a opinar, puedes, si algo no te gusta, puedes decirle al mayordomo que algo no te está pareciendo, no te pueden gritar, ni te pueden exigir más de lo que puedas hacer. Ok, primero que nada, yo llegué a este país muy chiquita, de 10 años. Desde esa edad yo empecé a trabajar en los files. De ahí viene mi fuerza laboral, porque aprendí a trabajar de todo. Trabajos muy duros. Esos trabajos en toda mi vida me hicieron fuerte laboralmente. Y ahora, sabiendo lo de la UFW, que me he aprendido muchísimo trabajando con un contrato de unión, eso me ha empoderado, me ha hecho fuerte y sabia.
Bueno, mi trabajo en el campo, yo podo viñas, hago la poda de la viña y pisco mandarina, pisco la cherry, toda clase de fruta como es el durazno, el nectarí, chabacano, ciruela, todo eso es lo que piscamos en el campo y toda la uva de wine de marqueta. Bueno, por ejemplo, ahorita andamos amarrando guías de la viña del wine. La estamos formando los brazos porque acabamos de hacer la poda y ahorita estamos amarrando esas guías con té verde por horas, estamos 8 horas. Bueno, mi trabajo como campesino es muy importante porque para mí de ahí nosotros pagamos la renta, pagamos los biles, comemos, nos alimentamos y alimentamos también a todo el resto del país. El trabajo en el campo es uno de los trabajos muy duros que realizamos nosotros los campesinos. Andamos en tiempo de frío, en tiempo de calor, ahorita con la lluvia, andamos dentro del lodo y en realidad este trabajo es duro, es pesado, pero es nuestro trabajo como campesino. Es un poco, pues más bien es agobiante para nosotros los campesinos porque, por ejemplo, hoy en día el precio de la poda, el precio de por horas no nos ha subido, los contratos no han subido el mismo precio de 2-3 años para atrás y sabemos que la renta pues es duro para pagarla, no nos alcanza el sueldo de los contratos hoy en día porque no le han subido. Bueno, no en sí no la tenemos, solamente a veces los mayordomos o los contratistas, si te lastimas, a veces te mandan que vayas con un sobador, o a veces también nos mandan a Concentra, pero ahí si vas lastimado ya luego te mandan a trabajar y te dicen no, pues ya estás bien, ya puedes trabajar y en realidad no, o sea, nos tratan a nosotros algo inferior, pues. Bueno, para mí sería bueno pues que todos los campesinos nos organizáramos para que así pudiera nuestra voz, pudiera hacer el cambio, pudieran escuchar, ¿verdad?, las compañías, los contratistas, que con el sueldo que nosotros ganamos no nos alcanza para sobrevivir, para pagar la renta y todo, la comida. Y sí, sería bueno que nosotros los campesinos nos uniéramos todos y levantar nuestra voz para que pues subieran los sueldos, subieran los contratos y así poder alcanzar nosotros pagar la renta. Pues primeramente nuestras familias, ¿verdad? Porque de nuestro trabajo comen nuestras familias y comemos nosotros. Y eso me motiva para seguir adelante y también para nuestra gente, nuestros padres, nuestras familias que quedaron allá en nuestro país, poder ayudarlos de esta forma y pues eso es lo que nos motiva a seguir trabajando aquí en el campo. En realidad sí, el campesino estamos expuestos a todos los químicos, a los pesticidas, porque es lo que se aplica en el campo, los pesticidas, en la almendra, en la fruta, en la cherry, en la uva. Ahí se aplican pesticidas, que esos pesticidas nosotros estamos respirándolos ahí de cerca y eso nos causa a veces mareos, a veces vómitos. Esos pesticidas, según las estadísticas, dice que produce con el tiempo cáncer, ¿verdad? Entonces, nosotros estamos expuestos a los pesticidas porque muchas de las veces no usamos máscara, no nos dan máscara en los trabajos. A veces tenemos que ponernos un pañuelo para protegernos o a veces no consentimos el pañuelo. Entonces, así nada más. Y sí, estamos expuestos a esos pesticidas, todo el campesino que está en los files. Bueno, yo me gustaría compartir a todos los alumnos, a todos los estudiantes, que le echen ganas en sus estudios. La vida del campo es muy pesado, es duro, el sueldo es muy bajo y yo les recomiendo que siguieran estudiando y que se prepararan para que ellos no trabajaran en el campo. No que sea un trabajo malo, es bueno, pero es duro, es pesado trabajar en la calor, trabajar en el frío. Es muy duro y nos pagan muy poco y no nos alcanza. Nosotros con mucho gusto piscamos toda la fruta para que lleguen a los mercados, a las tiendas, las uvas, el wine, para que llegue a todas las tiendas y así puedan disfrutar todo el país esas verduras, esas frutas frescas. Bueno, como campesino me hace sentir orgulloso que nosotros los campesinos, aunque haga frío, aunque haga calor, aunque llueva, nosotros estamos allí trabajando el campo para que toda la gente pueda disfrutar y comer los tomates, las frutas y todo eso. Para mí eso es un orgullo, ya que he visto las estadísticas que el 65% de la economía del país viene del campo y para mí es un orgullo trabajar en los campos, en los files, para que este país se levante.
Sí, bueno, la actividad que yo desempeño es de tractorista, irrigación, le riego el cultivo del camote y pues desde el principio hasta el fin de la cosecha trabajamos ahí en esta empresa. Pues es bastante duro, es muy cansado. El trabajo del campo sí es bastante pesado, pero pues me gusta. Es pesado en ocasiones, pero es gratificante porque pues ganas una cantidad ya más mejor con el contrato de la unión. Era muy cruel. Era bastante cruel el trato que había hacia los trabajadores por parte de los mayordomos. Sí, era insoportable trabajar allí, pero pues por necesidad aguantábamos esos malos tratos y esas condiciones laborales que nos ofrecía los mayordomos más que nada. Pues yo tengo aquí 5 años en esta compañía. Y hasta hace un mes prácticamente fue cuando cambiaron las cosas, pero ha habido un cambio significativo en cuestión del trato, el cómo se dirigían los mayordomos, los supervisores hacia un trabajador. Anteriormente había muchos gritos, yo las considero faltas de respeto, pero era la forma de manejarse de los mayordomos hacia los trabajadores. Pues la verdad no sé si haya estado enterado él o solo sea el supervisor que se ha manejado así con los trabajadores, pero si él estaba enterado de todos estos malos tratos, pues se me hace verdaderamente injusto e inhumano. Pues ha sido difícil. Los supervisores no se han logrado adaptar a las nuevas reglas de la unión. Ha sido difícil para ellos. Esas reglas más justas vienen ahora con el contrato de la unión. Esas reglas no eran respetadas por la compañía. Lamentablemente el trabajo en el field es muy mal pagado. No se nos aprecia como debería de apreciarse el trabajo. Pero ahora pues hay una nueva visión para nosotros en esta área. Con la ayuda de la unión puede haber algo mejor que lo que había anteriormente. Por el momento no se logró negociar un seguro clínico. Tenemos la confianza de que en la siguiente negociación se pueda lograr ese acuerdo para que podamos obtener ese beneficio. Yo no fui parte de la negociación, pero estuve apoyando de cerca este movimiento. Lamentablemente no tuve la oportunidad de poder asistir a las negociaciones.
I knew Cesar Chavez the last 24 years of his life. This is my 55th year with the movement. I was his press secretary, speechwriter, but by far the biggest challenge was serving as his personal aide. Cesar would take me with him almost everywhere in California and often out of state. Many academics, they see farm labor as a macro science to be analyzed with data and statistics, but it's not. It's a microscience. Unless you know what is happening on the ground, farm by farm, campaign by campaign, you can't really understand the history or the present day. So let's cut through the data and the statistics that is used by academia and the industry. 5 decades ago, when I was Cesar's press and personal aide, I heard him describe what is at the heart of the dilemma. A farm labor system in this country and state that treats farm workers as if they are agricultural implements or beasts of burden instead of human beings. Cesar said that growers and labor contractors treat farm workers as if we are not important human beings. And that is what is at the heart of all the abuse and the exploitation, the abject poverty, the miserable living and working conditions, the heat deaths, the sexual harassment, the cynical abuse and the retaliation by employers against farm workers who speak up and stand up for their rights. It accounts for the 50% of farm workers in Yolo County, which is home to UC Davis, who complain about food insecurity. It accounts for the 62% of farm workers in California who fear retaliation by their employers if they complain, according to a study by UC Merced. There is a choice to be made. You can either stand with the oppressed or you can stand with the oppressors. It's as simple as that. Let's take just one contemporary pressing issue. Farm workers won the right to vote in union elections in 1975 with enactment of the California Agricultural Labor Relations Act. And yet, when they tried using that law over the years, the only place they could usually vote would be on the grower property. And there they had to run a gauntlet of abuse and intimidation from foremen and supervisors and labor contractors and union-busting consultants. That would be like making political voters of color only be able to vote at the MAGA headquarters. So the United Farm Workers fought over 2 years to win a law in 2022 that would let farm workers vote in the same way that political voters in California have cast ballots for generations, and that is vote from the safety and security of their own homes. The UFW always insisted that if workers could vote safely, that they would vote to choose a union. The UFW has recently been certified by the Agricultural Labor Relations Board as bargaining representative for farm workers who voted for the union at 5 companies recently. And more victories are coming. 2 contracts have now been negotiated and signed under that law. For years, farm workers only won pay increases when the state minimum wage was increased. But the UFW has helped pull the wages of many farm workers up above the minimum wage in some large agricultural regions through pressure on non-union companies because of both union organizing and union contract gains. When the union is active in an area, non-union growers know that they need to treat and pay people at least a little better than they were, or they risk giving the union opportunities. Now forget for a moment the 2016 state law the UFW won in California, providing farm workers with overtime pay after 8 hours a day, which, at least in California, ended the racist exclusion of farm workers from the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act of 1928. Why were farm workers excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act and all the New Deal progressive social labor protections enacted in the 1930s? Well, who were farm workers in the 1930s in the South? And in the West, they were African Americans in the South, and in the West, many of them were Latinos and Filipinos. The Southern Dixiecrat segregationist lawmakers demanded of President Roosevelt that the only way they would vote for those New Deal protections would be if farm workers were excluded. Farm workers under union contracts enjoy decent pay and full family health care and paid holidays and vacations, real protections on the job from abuses ranging from discrimination to sexual harassment. Many even have defined benefit pension plans. And this belies the notion that farm labor has to be this dead-end, no-benefit occupation. I would hear Cesar Chavez push back at many well-meaning people who would say that farm worker kids needed to get a good education so they could escape the fields because there was no economic future in it. And Cesar would respond, he would say that farm work can be decent work. It can pay decently. It can provide benefits with unionization. And he really rejected the notion that farm workers are in this low-wage, no-benefit occupation. It didn't have to be that way. The UFW has always punched above its weight, to borrow a boxing metaphor. In 2005, the UFW convinced then Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger to issue the first comprehensive standards in the nation to prevent farm and other outdoor workers from dying or becoming very ill in extreme temperatures. In 2015, the UFW worked with the Jerry Brown administration to strengthen those standards and improve their enforcement, so that today we don't see the spate of heat deaths of farm workers that we were once seeing in California. In 2019, the UFW won the abolition in California agriculture of the toxic chemical chlorpyrifos, which damages the brains and lowers the IQs of fetuses, infants, and toddlers. It had been banned for years in household chemicals like Raid, but not in agriculture. The UFW also worked in the Obama administration with the Federal Environmental Protection Agency to follow the advice of its scientists and abolish chlorpyrifos nationally. When Trump came in, he reversed the abolition. When President Biden took office, he restored it. And now we're not sure what's going to happen. The UFW negotiated with the nation's grower associations to craft the agricultural immigration reform legislation that would let undocumented farm workers in this country now earn the right to permanently stay here by continuing to work in agriculture. That legislation passed the U.S. House of Representatives with 30 Republican votes in 2021. It was bipartisan legislation. Undocumented farm workers know that their immigration status, the pervasive fear that they face every day, makes them so vulnerable to being abused and exploited. Adjusting their status is, in many cases, more important to them than even better pay or even unionization. The last time he was president, Trump attempted to cut farm worker pay under the H-2A agricultural guest worker program. The UFW had to go to federal court to stop him. Today, growers are cynically using the threat of mass deportation and higher food prices in an attempt to expand the exploitive H-2A guest worker program. What they want to do is they want to replace the domestic workforce, which is composed of both documented and undocumented workers, with H-2A workers brought in from outside the country. H-2A workers are at a greater disadvantage than undocumented farm workers. At least undocumented farm workers, if they are mistreated, they can leave and go work somewhere else. H-2A workers are more vulnerable because they are at the total mercy of their employers, who obtain and hold the visas that allow them to come to this country. H-2A workers who complain about mistreatment are immediately sent home. H-2A system is essentially serfdom. The UFW doesn't want to see farm workers deported, but it also doesn't want to see them exploited. When I began with the movement, I was 19 years old, shy, quiet young kid, and there's something about being shot at on a picket line that focuses the mind, or being with Cesar twice in the 70s when federal agents notified the Union about assassination plots, or constantly traveling in the company of a security detail. In 1971, the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms Bureau of the Justice Department notified the Union about a plot on his life. The UFW even received photographs of the hitman who had been hired, Buddy Gene Prochnow, from Oildale near Bakersfield. The California Highway Patrol arrested him outside Salinas, only about 10 miles from where Cesar had been the day before. He had been stalking him. Cesar went on the road for a couple weeks, never sleeping in the same place twice. Finally, he told his wife, Helen, that he was going to go back to La Paz, our headquarters, and go back to work. He said, I'm not a coward. I haven't done anything wrong except fight for workers' rights. I'm going to go back to work. And if they kill me, then so be it, if that's God's will. And that's when the fence around his house was erected and the security detail got beefed up. Before Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, many people with a lot better educations and a lot more resources tried and failed to organize farm workers. So why was it that Cesar succeeded where others failed for 80 years before him? And I think that a lot of it had to do with the fact that most of those unions that would come in and try to organize were imposed from the outside. Very few of them were really composed of indigenous farm workers. And that was where Cesar and the UFW was different. You can't impose a solution from the outside. Real, lasting, meaningful change will only come when the people who are directly affected make change happen for themselves. And that's what the UFW is all about. It's farm workers themselves at the companies where they work, voting in the union, organizing themselves, negotiating with their employer. Cesar, he believed that change would come when farm workers had the ability to sit across the bargaining table with their employers as equals. So they wouldn't just have to take orders all their lives. And I think really, as much as improving farm worker wages and benefits and conditions, what Cesar and the UFW were about was really empowerment. I think it's very important to remember that history of farm labor, and that view glosses over some tidbits of reality, many of which I lived through. Cesar Chavez had to build and then rebuild the UFW 3 times. First, between 1965 and 1970, during the first Delano grape strike. Then it had to be rebuilt again in 1973 after grape growers cynically turned over their union contracts to a rival union, the Teamsters Union, denying farm workers any say over what union they would have. It gave thousands of grape workers no choice but to walk out of the vineyards on strike. There's something about getting shot at on a picket line that kind of focuses the mind. At the height of that bitter and bloody 1973 grape strike, I was on a UFW picket line outside Early Mart when a scab, a strikebreaker, walked out of the struck vineyard with a rifle firing at us from across the street. You could hear it. Pop, pop, pop. When growers' union contracts came up for renegotiation, they'd engage in these slick corporate reshuffling maneuvers. Company A would go out of business and emerge the next day as Company B. Same land, same equipment, same management, but a whole new non-union workforce. Tens of thousands of farm workers had broken into the lower middle class because of the protections of their union contracts. They lost those hard-won victories. Thousands of union members were fired. Many were blacklisted. Some were beaten. Rene Lopez was 21. He led a UFW strike at Sakima Dairy in Fresno County. He had just emerged from voting for the UFW during a state-conducted election when he was shot in the face by 2 grower gunmen, becoming the 5th UFW martyr, 1 woman and 4 men who were killed during union strikes. Before the murder, the UFW had begged Deukmejian's political appointees at the Agricultural Labor Relations Board to go and get a court injunction to prohibit the foreman from brandishing firearms. They refused. So the fix that the Farm Labor Law was supposed to create didn't work because of virulent, decades-long industry resistance to unionization. And because over 16 years, under 2 Republican governors, most neutral observers today will admit that enforcement of the law was shut down. It's funny how these little tidbits of information are left out of the story. Farm workers have sacrificed their blood, sweat, and tears to win some historic reforms to remedy the exploitation and poverty they endure. So it is so disingenuous for some people to claim that these fixes in reality may not end up helping the people they were designed to help. Whenever you hear horror stories about farm worker abuse, growers will say, oh, they can't be true. California has the toughest laws and regulations in the nation protecting farm workers. And they're right. But the UFW has an adage that reflects the actual reality, and that is that the laws on the books are not always the laws in the fields. It is so disingenuous to ignore the virulent union-busting strategies successfully applied by growers all those decades. The Agricultural Labor Relations Act of 1975 stated as its purpose, quote, to encourage and protect, end quote, the right of farm workers to organize. Yet even at the dawn of the law, it never fulfilled its promises. In September 1975, I helped Cesar draft a telegram he sent to Governor Jerry Brown. It read in part, "Your law has become one more vehicle with which growers can oppress farm workers." Now fast forward to the 2020s. Sacramento Bee opinion editor Marcos Breton wrote a column about, quote, how growers' absolute power over the powerless works. He said that farm workers have too often experienced how the most historic California law protecting their rights has failed to do so, as reflected in case after case, decision after decision issued by the State Agricultural Labor Relations Board. So this is not UFW rhetoric. The agricultural industry has created its own cottage industry of union-busting consultants and attorneys who make a science out of intimidating and retaliating against farm workers who stand up for their rights. This is how growers' absolute power over the powerless works in reality. In California, the right of farm workers to vote in union elections was enshrined since the law passed in 1975. Yet when farm workers actually tried voting in a union, they were still stuck back in 1975, when just about the only way that political voters in those days could cast ballots was at set polling places. Under the 75 law, agricultural workers can only vote at polling places, nearly always set on grower property. And to do that, they must run a gauntlet of threats and intimidation and deportation by employer foremen, supervisors, and labor contractors. Remember, most farm workers are immigrants. Most of them are undocumented. Nearly all of them fall well below the poverty line. To preserve that status quo, the growers argue that they only wanted to help farm workers by preserving the right to vote in elections nearly exclusively held on grower property. I was 19 years old when I first became active with the movement. And since then, I earned 2 college degrees from the University of California. But the most important lessons that I learned in my life, I learned working with Cesar and the movement. Lessons about commitment and self-sacrifice, about what it means to be a man. Someone once told me once that the greatest thing you can achieve in your life is being a man or a woman of your times. When my comrades and I in the movement were young, we lived in momentous times. We helped each other do some great things. We didn't everywhere succeed, but at least we can take some comfort in realizing that we didn't sit on the sidelines. We joined the fight. We got to know what it means to be part of something that's bigger than we are. I think everyone needs to be part of something that's bigger than they are. I think that's part of what life is all about.
I'm really proud of the fact that by bringing not just Taco Bell was the first step on the campaign for fair food. 2 years after Taco Bell and Yum Brands signed, through the campaign for fair food, we brought McDonald's, Burger King, Subway, Whole Foods, Bon Appetit, Aramark, Sodexo, Compass Group, most of the fast food corporations, with the exception of Wendy's in terms of like the bigger ones, and even Walmart is on board. Whole Foods, Trader Joe's. In total, there's 14 different corporations that have signed on to the Fair Food program. That Fair Food Program didn't exist when we signed with Taco Bell. But the idea was to create that code of conduct where we would be sitting at the table, and this code of conduct would be crafted by workers themselves, because the experiences that we have determine what is needed more clearly than anything else. So in the process of creating that code of conduct, it's that we were able to craft the Fair Food Program. That includes protections for workers in regards to violence. Violence is not tolerated. There's zero tolerance for modern day slavery, zero tolerance for child labor, and zero tolerance for sexual assault. And any abuse that happens and is reported from a worker in a participating farm, if a farm says, oh no, I'm not going to allow the investigators to come in, give them full access as it is stated, and I'm going to interfere in any form with the investigation, then that farm is in non-compliance. That means that that farm is going to receive an ultimatum with a time frame that is reasonable for him to fix the problem that was reported so that they can be in good stand with the Fair Food Program, and or they are going to eventually be expelled out of the program. What that means is this: corporations that have signed legally binding agreements with us, as well as the growers, have to comply. If a grower refuses to comply with respecting the rights that are included in the code of conduct, then they cannot sell. That means millions and millions of potential losses for failing to protect the human rights of their own workforce. And in a very close competition with each other, then that can mean a really, really difficult position to be in terms of as a business, right? So no one wants to be in that position, because if you see the positive side of it, it is a blessing also for those growers who choose to treat workers better. Why? Because, corporations that have not signed with the Fair Food Program, they can pick up their marbles and leave. And corporations that we have tried to invite to the table to join onto the Fair Food Program, to sign the agreement and commit to buy from farms that are implementing these codes, they have go to Mexico. When this is one example, they went to Mexico and basically punished the growers for doing the right thing. Now, when a corporation signs onto the program, they establish a legally binding agreement to buy from farms that are implementing these rights. So it's a blessing for the farms that are doing everything in their power to implement these provisions. There was one company that came first, Pacific Tomato Growers. They have been amazing as partners. Then Lipman is another of the bigger companies that when they saw, this company has signed to join onto the Fair Food Program, and all the buyers, because of the legally binding agreements, have to concentrate their buying onto this company. So that's going to place the rest in a competitive disadvantage. I'm sure that was what's going on in the minds of many of the growers. So Lipman came in not very far after that moment in 2010. The entire Tomato Growers Exchange, which represents 90% of the tomato industry of Florida, Florida-based companies that have production up and down the East Coast, came on board. That was 2010 and was set to begin in 2011. That's when we started to apply this to 90% of the tomato growers in Florida in a partnership where we were all looking for the same things because of the power of the market. In 2014, Walmart came on board. The buying power of Walmart was so incredible that it allowed us to expand these protections to the production in Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, and it has expanded with that power to 10 states until this year. The program has been guaranteeing that workers can speak without fear of retaliation.
We put together a survey that's going on right now between 5 agricultural organizations. We're heading it up with a firm in DC. And it's to deal with the Social Security issue that these workers are not going to get. And they've already turned 65. And just because the government, the Congress, hasn't moved forward at all for the last 30, 40 years for immigration reform, these people are being told they are not eligible for any Social Security at all. They paid, the employer paid. So the survey we're doing is to give the Treasury, give the Social Security, give the Department of Labor and the Department of Justice what those numbers look like across the country of over 65. And then how do we get Social Security benefits to them? If we haven't passed any immigration reform over the past 30 years at all, the Congress has used it as a political football for presidential elections. And even with Obama passing or doing an executive order for Dreamers, for DACA, you can't do that. That's right now in the Supreme Court of the United States waiting for a ruling of how DACA is not going to be legal because the president of a country, the United States, cannot implement laws and regulations. He can do executive orders, but they're short time. Okay? So in that fact is that our survey is to give the information to the agencies, to the Congress to say, look, in the no match account in the Social Security, there's $38 billion that has been paid by the worker, by the grower. In fact, if those monies are there, then we have got to figure out a way how we get this to those folks that are ready for retirement. As the New York Times did a story in December of 23 and in 24, a woman in the fields in vegetables in New York stating that the only way she is going to get Social Security, she has to work until she dies in the field. That's insane. But we also have a really bad immigration policy at the border. We're letting a lot of people come in for asylums and everything and giving them a 10-year and a work card and a Social Security. But yet the people that were here during COVID fed the world, put their lives, their families, and yet we don't even have the courage as congressional leaders to give work authorization to these people.
I mean, anytime you make substantial change to the relationship between grower and farm worker, growers are going to complain. I'll tell you a story. I got to the Salinas Valley in 1974, and at that time, the group I worked for, California Rural Legal Assistance, was just finishing a legal attack on an instrument that growers used to use called a short handle hoe. So the farm workers would have to be stooped all day long, whatever crop they were working. And we were trying to get the short handle hoe outlawed and force growers to use a long handle hoe. And when I got here, the Supreme Court had already said that our approach was legally sound. So we were having administrative hearings to prove that the short handle hoe was indeed an unsafe tool for farm workers. And when the growers were giving testimony, it was productivity is going to go down, this is going to destroy the lettuce industry, blah, 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 blah. We were successful. And look it up in the Salinas, Californian. A year later, there is a headline quoting one of the largest growers in the valley saying, I don't understand it, productivity went up. It's just that farm workers were more comfortable using the long-handled hoe. So there had to be a shift in the business model that growers were using at that point to switch over to the long-handled hoe. And with farm workers getting overtime, with farm workers getting minimum wage, with farm workers getting all of these protections, growers are complaining. But I think that in the end, what they're complaining about is that there has to be a shift in their business model. They just want to continue doing things the way they've been doing it forever. And they don't want to have to deal with the challenge of creating a new business model that takes into account all of these protections that California has been legislating. Same thing is happening with the fast food industry. I mean, the business model was that you find really cheap labor among really young people to become a millionaire and a billionaire. And what the law now says that, wait a minute, you've got to pay these people $20 an hour. What it means is that that business model where franchise owners can become rich off of real cheap labor doesn't exist anymore. So they're going to have to come up with a business model, and they will. All these stories about how we're going to go out of business, it's BS. They'll find a way to stay in business because there's so much demand for fast food in California.
I think there are 3 levels on which each of us has a role in improving the situation for everyone in California, including the families who feed us. One is to make sure that we are voting for policies and people who try to understand the immigrants who work to feed us, who try to understand their lives and their well-being and the contributions they make, and doesn't make assumptions or blanket statements about them that aren't founded in real situations, in reality. Another is to try to buy fruits and vegetables from farms, from companies that are doing their best to treat all their workers well. It's important for us in California to be aware of a lot of things. We have to be aware of droughts and water and how our environment is functioning and how our farmers are treated and that they are respected and can make a living. And we need to make sure that all the people who work on those farms, farm workers, are treated well. So the more we can look into the ways in which people are treated on different farms, in different packing plants, in different cold storage units, and try to support the ones that are trying hard so that they get a reward for treating their workers well, the better for everyone. And the third level is when we hear someone, a friend or a family member, say something about immigrants or about farm workers that is a blanket statement that's not true, that's discriminatory, that acts like they're completely separate from society as opposed to being a core contributor to society, we can try to change those narratives. We can share what we've learned about real farm workers who are real people, someone's mom, someone's brother, someone's dad, and we can change the way in which we understand each other and understand that our well-being is linked together within California.